Hey everyone, I'm currently talking to no one, but I'll just give it a couple of minutes to let people know that we are starting, and then hopefully we can begin. Thanks to everyone who's joining, and welcome again. I'll just give it a couple more seconds perhaps. So perhaps just as we are waiting, I can kind of describe the format of the book club. We usually, or for the past few months during the pandemic, as friends of the Centre for Hizmet Studies, some volunteers from the Hizmet movement here in the UK, where the centre is based, we'd begun reading and debating books and the context of them from a critical lens amongst ourselves, and we'd read 3 books so far, and then we had this kind of increased motivation to open it up to more people and have more people involved in the book club as a whole, and we thought the next step would be taking it live. We weren't sure exactly of the platform, but we're here today or tonight, and hopefully we'll get it up and running and working. And the format that we usually take is, that we all read the book, and then I, spend some time describing the content of the book for perhaps half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we have a discussion at the end of the book club. So today's format will be in a similar way, where we'll be discussing the format of one of our shorter publications. This time, in today's session, we'll be discussing one of our own publications, and this publication in itself is important because it's a chapter from a larger book that the Dialogue Society had published, and in the book there were several chapters. One of them was dedicated to the theological and theoretical background to Gulen's understanding in dialogue, and I think that's important to kind of pick apart and understand the motivations behind many of these dialogue activities and facilities that we see happening around the world. And this chapter is particularly important for one reason. It also has Ahmet Kurucan's notes in it, so they're kind of fed into the arguments, which is something you notice if you look down at the footnotes of the book. And these are notes that he's taken in his sermons, in the sermons when Gulen has been talking, and Ahmet Kurucan has incorporated and taken notes on dialogue itself. So the book is written by an academic. The chapter itself, booklet, is written by Paul Weller and Francis Sleep. Together they kind of pulled it together. But its importance is the fact that it has that academic background, and also it has notes from Gulen's own sermons, which may not be so available in the format of analysis of what does this mean for dialogue in itself. So the booklet is nice in the sense that it brings everything all together. So I'm just going to start now. I think we're a good number to kind of get into the content of the book itself. It's if you've read it, the content page has some acknowledgements, and then there is a foreword written by our co-chair Dr. Ismail Sezgin at the Centre for Hizmet Studies, and then there's a quick summary of the book. There's a biographical explanation of some key points in Gulen's life and how that's linked to dialogue and dialogue theories itself. Then it goes on to the dialogue in theory and what this means, what dialogue means for Gulen, first of all. And then the next section is dialogue in practice. And perhaps there, where we say dialogue in practice, we can talk about and discuss how, social movement, Hizmet, and then all of the lower branches have kind of embodied the theology itself and how it is acted out in different organizations, whether that's educational organizations or other Hizmet charity works on a global scale. So, just skipping through some of the main content again to reiterate, there is an acknowledgement for Ahmed Kurucan's assistance in, providing his own personal notes when we get to the content itself. In the foreword, and just to kind of be on a perhaps critical perspective whilst reading it, because it is written by our co-director, Dr. Ismail Sezgin. You can kind of tell the bias of the report as it goes, the kind of language used. So I've just highlighted, Gulen is not just a scholar and a thinker, but a doer who has inspired millions to think and act alongside him, which this kind of language is reiterated throughout the booklet. It's not necessarily a bad thing that the booklet has a positive approach, but that's the kind of language that we're taking, rather than being, a perhaps more critical or deeply analysis academic book, or for political orientation. Perhaps this one is more giving a theological explanation, and it is written with examples from the movement itself. And then at the end, it kind of concludes with principles of dialogue and how dialogue theology, which Gulen has kind of introduced or theorized, are put into play and acted. So just some sections that I've highlighted from the summary. For Gulen, dialogue is part of a fabric of Islam, and this is a kind of theme that runs throughout this chapter, about dialogue not being a means, perhaps, although it can be, but it is actually a part of Islam. So dialogue as a theological dimension can be perhaps seen as, an extension of to what worship is in Islam. If worship is within the fabric of Islam, dialogue is also in the fabric of Islam. So there is an Islamic perspective to it. The section goes on to continue. It's a religious duty, not just encouraged, but required. And this is what we say by, it's the fabric of Islam. Dialogue is required by the values and commands of the Quran, which we're going to have some examples later on, the Sunnah, and the character of our God-given human nature, which I think is important, and these are all things that are going to come up. But in line with these, Gulen also says, it's important for these to develop naturally. We're not forging something. This is part of human nature, and that's again something that will come up. It later describes human-centric discourse, and an intention in diversity itself as part of Allah's creation. And then, Gulen also talks about diversity in race, in religion, in nation, and way of life as being something that should be valued because it was intended by God. And therefore, another significant kind of backdrop for why dialogue was theologized, perhaps if we can kind of term such a phrase. When we talk about the theology behind dialogue, though, we have three key concepts, and I'm sure if I first say them in Turkish, then our Turkish listeners will be familiar with them. Gönül insanı, so being a person of the heart. Müsbet hareket, so taking positive action, and then finally hüsnü zan. So these three Islamic kind of concepts which Gulen kind of characterizes actually form the basis of dialogue. Again, gönül insanı, being a person of the heart, müsbet hareket, taking positive action, proactive positive action, and hüsnü zan, thinking positively of others. And by extension, if anyone here is familiar with the writings of Gulen, Gulen also says hüsnü zan, for example, thinking positively of others, is actually a form of worship. The opposite itself is what you could take it as however you would define that. But for these things, these concepts which build up dialogue itself, which Gulen says is in the fabric of Islam, are also considered worship, which I think is really important to kind of see the levels, and this theme extends throughout this text. And then finally at the end of the book we see these theologies actually embodied by members of the Hizmet movement and then kind of taken, and from this inspiration you have a variety of both schools, in conflict regions such as Afghanistan, in southeast Turkey, where you have, perhaps the Kurdish-Turkish conflicts, in northern Iraq, where you have, a very, very diverse population, and you see a lot of conflict happening on society level. You see that the role that these Gulen-inspired schools play in actually having dialogue amongst themselves, and then how that impacts and is reflected on society as a whole. So I think that's important, and that's something that will come to at the very end of the text. There is kind of a relatively short introduction of Gulen, his full name Muhammed Fethullah Gulen, as being a Turkish Muslim scholar, an opinion leader, and peace advocate, which I think is something that we see coming through again in the book. He was born in Erzurum, kind of eastern province of Turkey. He worked as a state licensed preacher between 1959 and 1981. And he comments on issues such as responsibility, modernity, science, society, and the linkage between these and faith. He has authored over 60 books and continues to write the editorial for a number of periodicals. We've got The Fountain written here. There's the kind of Turkish equivalent, which is now Çağlayan, and you have Gulen commenting and providing literary sources for these as well. A section which I highlighted from the text, which I really liked. He is not a liberal, modernist reformer. He speaks within the Sunni Hanafi tradition of Islam, offering an authentic rereading of religion, suggesting new ways of engaging with contemporary ideas and realities, which I think is really important, because when perhaps maybe people from the Hizmet movement or outside the Hizmet movement try to kind of define Gulen's stance, you have this thing, is he a liberal then? Is he a modernist? For example, you can take that Gulen says, there is no way other than democracy. Perhaps there may be ills that come with democracy, but he is for democracy. So does this make him a modernist? Does this make him a liberal? What this book says, and from the information that we've got from his personal sermons, is that he is neither a liberal, he is not a modernist, he is not a reformer. He is working within the Sunni Hanafi tradition of Islam, and with these kind of readings, he's performing a rereading. But if one was to ask Gulen if he was doing this, he would I think reject that, because doing this would mean something for his Islamic stature and kind of hierarchy in that as a whole. Just some other things that I've highlighted. So after talking about his life, there's a little section on his efforts in dialogue. So whilst Gulen's exposition of Islam has always been inclusive and dialogic, it was in early 1990s that he began advocating for dialogue initiatives. So 1990s onwards, and perhaps those who know Turkish history well, you have the 80s coup, and then you have this kind of shift, and you had a lot of otherings and political dimensions which caused conflict within Turkey. And this is kind of in the trajectory of that, in which Gulen kind of does a lot of things that are revolutionary in Turkey. He has visits with various religious and ethnic leaders, and that includes people from the Turkish Orthodox community, the Turkish Armenian community, the Jewish leaders and rabbi of Turkey, the Alevi community, and for a Sunni Muslim leader or preacher in Turkey to be doing this was a big thing at the time. Although perhaps with those who were involved in dialogue, that would be a normal thing. You would sit around with your Christian neighbors, your Alevi neighbors perhaps, but at the time it was something outlandish perhaps. And Gulen later on, he was personally involved in setting the Journalist and Writers Foundation up, and the purpose of the Journalist and Writers Foundation, Gazeteciler ve Yazarlar Vakfı, was to kind of bring people of opposing and different views and world views together. And just some for all these efforts, was in 2010 awarded an honorary doctorate by Leeds Metropolitan University. In 2011 in New York, he was awarded the EWI Peacebuilding Award. The Senate of the U.S. state of Texas passed a resolution commending him for his contributions to global peace. So what we see in a very brief summary of his life is that he started off as a religious preacher. The perhaps political socio context of Turkey and his own embodiment of values that we spoke about has caused him, or perhaps the rereading that he's done has caused him to have the differing views. And then we go on to kind of one of the main sections in this booklet, really, is the Dialogue in Theory, which was the title of the book the Dialogue Society had published. Dialogue in Theory book is kind of trying to understand the dialogue theory of Gulen himself. And for Gulen, as a religious leader, this is primarily a religious theology and religious argument and a religious theory. Like we said, we have the three key terms: Gönül insanı being a person of the heart, Müsbet hareket taking proactive and positive action, and hüsnü zan thinking well of the other, perhaps in situations where it may not be apparent to us. So from the book, I'll just read a little. Gulen's conception and practice of dialogue developed through the 1970s and 80s. That is the conflictual era in recent Turkish politics. And this was a time where various groups based on economic class, ideology, had this confrontation with one another. And Gulen began to use his role as a state licensed preacher, not only in mosques, but in coffee houses, which kind of increased his popularity very, very fast. But 1990s onward, he encouraged dialogue events in the form of organizational events. And then you see the Journalists and Writers Foundation as well then being formed. Through his teachings and advice, he sought to bridge the divide between science and religion, secular and religious worldviews, leftists and rightists, Alevis and Sunnis, Turks and Kurds. And what you see here is Gulen hasn't left Turkey. So how he's structured dialogue himself, how he's structured the theology behind dialogue himself is reflected in his own experiences. If we're considering a leftist and rightist, you're seeing the 70s and early 80s conflicts, Alevis and Sunnis, Turks and Kurds. These are all things that are familiar to him. But rapidly, after that period, Gulen does see it on a global scale, but that is something that comes later when he goes on travels across the initially Europe. So the kinds of dialogue efforts encouraged by Gulen are inclusive, they're open-ended, they're action-oriented, they involve ordinary people, and for Gulen this is key. It's not enough for world leaders to be engaged in dialogue. Dialogue needs to be something that he will theologize as being part of human nature and also the fabric of Islam, and because of this, it is inclusive. It is inclusive of every individual, and it is a responsibility for every individual. It's not just a responsibility for the world leaders, and when the world leaders do it, you may not attain what the end goal is anyway. For Gulen, dialogue itself consists not of dialogue events, but interactions that result of such occasions. Dialogue initiatives should be action-oriented in the sense of moving beyond mere words of mutual well-wishing and undertakings that bring about real, substantial and meaningful encounters. What I had as a question mark perhaps for the authors of this piece is, okay, so what comes next? Are we going to have some examples of these works that should be done? How are we defining what is substantial, what is meaningful? Isn't particularly open and described by the authors here. It's kind of said in passing, and we do see the examples of how movements, people involved in the Hizmet movement have, acted upon this. But we don't get the examples of perhaps what it is that Gulen has theologized. So in that sense, perhaps, this is something that we could discuss at the end of the session, and maybe there is something within the theology itself that should be done. Dialogue initiatives should engage the grassroots of society, not only scholars or leaders, which is something that we've said. Gulen also acknowledges that achieving grassroots dialogue between ordinary people and mass will take a number of generations. So for Gulen, this isn't something that just happens and then it's all solidified in society. For Gulen, dialogue is something that will take generations. And generation doesn't mean 10 years, it doesn't mean 20 years, it doesn't mean 30 years. It means, more than that, which for someone to theologize that and to have faith in that and to be steadfast in that faith, I think is something admirable, just by saying. Another key point in the chapter here is Gulen's understanding of dialogue is not based on pragmatism, it's not a strategy. There isn't this kind of intent that this dialogue will necessarily lead somewhere. I mean, it's, dialogue shouldn't just be, okay, let's meet, have mutual understanding and separate, but there isn't necessarily a strategy to it either. Rather, it is deeply rooted within Islamic sources. It's rooted in the Quran, it's rooted in the Sunnah, the Sunnah being the kind of lifestyle of the Prophet, and tasawwuf or Sufism. And for dialogue to be rooted in these, to have a theological standing, also reiterates the fact that Gulen says, dialogue is in the fabric of Islam. It is a part of Islam. As well as nature, history, and contemporary perspectives also having impact on how we define dialogue. For Gulen, dialogue is part of the fabric of Islam, as we've reiterated, embedded in its very foundation. It is also a religious duty, not just encouraged but required by the values and commands of the Quran and Sunnah, and also by the character of our God-given human nature. Gulen advocates dialogue because of Islam, not despite it. So Gulen doesn't advocate dialogue because, for example, 9/11's happened and everyone's thinking negatively of Muslims. If 9/11 did not happen, Gulen still would have, and did prior to that as well, theologize dialogue. He engaged in dialogue. It's not because issues are happening on ground, although that is something that Gulen hopes dialogue will overcome, but it's because of Islam. It's because of the teachings of the Quran. It is because of the example of the Sunnah, and it is because of tasawwuf and how Sufism plays a role as well. So kind of summarizing that again, Gulen considers dialogue to be inherently and instrumentally valuable. The inherent aspect of dialogue being valuable is linked to the Islamic heritage of how Gulen theologizes dialogue, and it being instrumentally valuable is the fact that dialogue can build bridges amongst people. It can create the world into a much more peaceful society. And an example from the Quran is we made you into races and tribes so that you should get to know one another. That's from Surah Al-Hujra, verse number 13. Through knowing one another, we come to know ourselves, which in turn helps us to know our Creator, according to Gulen. That's a very Sufi understanding of this verse. So through knowing one another, we know the attributes of Allah, of our Creator more, and then through knowing those attributes, we will then be able to kind of recognize and know Allah more, which is a beautiful understanding of the verse, to say the least. So dialogue is instrumentally also valuable for Gulen, as we said, to kind of build durable solutions and shared problems, community building and peace building, perhaps conflict resolution. So there's inherent value in through dialogue. We actually understand ourselves, we understand one another, and through that we understand the attributes of God. Or there's the instrumental value of dialogue, which is peace building and society cohesion, perhaps, and these kind of elements which come through that. Gulen's approach is practice-focused, exemplified in the activities around the globe in civil society movements. So this continues. Again, like we said, this chapter continues to reiterate that Gulen's theology of dialogue is rooted in Islam. Let us now consider the underlying teachings and key concepts. So here we're going back to the three terms that we'd mentioned at the beginning. The first one being gönül insanı, to engage in dialogue, to being a person of the heart. A key point to note about Gulen's approach is that it is based on human-centric discourse. So Hizmet, within this kind of Gulen's understanding, the human is at the center. And the human really is the kind of unifying element, and it's in the example of the Quranic verse that we mentioned before. Because Gulen's worldview is God-centric, his view on dialogue is human-centric. To be able to understand God, we need to be able to understand humans. We need to be able to understand ourselves as humans, or Muslims believe that God created humanity from compassion, from love, firstly of the Prophet, and also for humanity. And because of this, human beings are the greatest manifestation of God's names and attributes. So without understanding humanity or one another, we cannot understand God and his multiple attributes. For example, the 99 names, to say the least, that there are more which can be attributed to God. That our humanity is the most basic commonality, and that before God, in terms of being created, all of creation is equal. Their faith, religion, nationality come second and are irrelevant at this level of understanding. So Gulen, famously said that I am first human and then Muslim. This is where that theological background to being human first and then Muslim comes from, at the very basic level, before faith, before religion, or before nationality, that there is an understanding of commonality, and through that one can also know God. So that's why this is kind of the early, very basic principle. Showing respect to a fellow human being is a reflection of one's respect to God and to his or her creator. And I think you can kind of turn that on the flip as well. If you don't show respect to your common humankind, you're not showing respect to Allah as well. And this is kind of the theology of gönül insanı. Being a person of the heart means that through showing compassion, through showing understanding to common humanity, whatever their faith, nationality, etc. is being gönül insanı, a person of the heart. And there is just kind of a section from an article, Portrait of the People of the Heart. So when Gulen is describing what the people of the heart look like, there is a section inside this chapter, and I just wanted to kind of read that as well. When talking about people who are gönül insanı, they open their hearts to everyone, welcoming them affectionately. Regarding their deeds and attributes, they try to be compatible with everyone. They try to avoid vicious competition with others. They try to show as much respect as possible to the philosophy and ideas that other people adopt. They turn a blind eye to what other people may do wrong. Such people nullify bad behavior with kindness, not thinking to hurt anybody, even when they have been hurt over and over again. And then, this section continues with a verse from the Quran. Had your Lord willed, all the people on earth would have believed. So if it was in Allah's intention, all of humanity would have been created Muslim, or all of humanity would have ended up being Muslim by the time they passed. So can you, O Prophet, that Allah is in this verse talking to the Prophet, compel people to believe? ? So if Allah had intended, he would have done that, and then he's kind of asking a rhetorical question to the Prophet here. Can you do this? It was in my divine intention, is in my divine plan for humanity that not everyone would believe, which is a nice continuation of that section. The Quran connects human diversity to the divine intention that human beings should get to know one another, which is something that we've discussed just above. Diversity requires us to learn how to live together in turn, which dialogue is needed. According to Gulen, the response to diversity through positive engagement and dialogue is one of the major goals that the divine has set for humankind. So for Gulen, if Allah has purposefully created diversity, then dialogue is needed. We need to talk to one another to get to know Allah. So therefore dialogue is also divinely intended, and dialogue itself is in the fabric of Islam. Gulen explains that the universe in all its diversity was created out of love and out of compassion. Love and compassion are underlying themes of Gulen's discourse and shape his views on dialogue, and obviously a pursuit of peace and justice as well. There is also a strong sense of humility in being a gönül insanı. Since everything is created and sustained through God, everything is also dependent on Him. No one can take credit for any good they do, as it is, and can only be done in a state of dependence of God. We must be humble in recognition of this fact, whatever we achieve. We cannot judge others according to Gulen, since we are all lost, but for the mercy of Allah. And this is kind of the element of husnuzan perhaps coming through, perceiving people in the better light. We cannot judge others according to Gulen. I'll just repeat that sentence again. Since we are all lost but the mercy of God, and no one has the right to limit or delimit the mercy of God but God Himself. We cannot judge and we cannot perhaps put that on a scale and judge, because that is a position that only Allah Himself has. And Gulen on this topic famously says, be a prosecutor towards yourself and an advocate for others. So if you're going to judge anyone or anything, or have any negative views towards anyone, have those towards yourself, and only compassion towards others. Barriers to dialogue are created by arrogant and judgmental attitudes, which is something that continues into the theme of hoşgörü, so thinking or empathetic acceptance is what's here. So hoşgörü is or was at some point within Hizmet literature commonly translated as tolerance, but that's not really what Gulen is intending to be understood from here. It's empathetic acceptance, and we'll come to exploring that term as well. Gulen repeatedly states that dialogue is about empathetic acceptance. There's accepting people as they are in their own right without judging or trying to change them, let alone convert them. So I think that's very important. Hoşgörü is seeing and accepting people who they are, not trying to engage in converting them. And I think the Hizmet movement is perhaps at times kind of commonly seen as being perhaps the Muslim equivalent of a missionary movement. Well, why are you in so many countries around the world? Why are you in Africa, for example? What intention may you have other than perhaps, a missionary understanding or kind of similarity? And that, in the modern world or the secular world, it's kind of how we form our own thoughts, being in line with the kind of opposite of whatever the Christian equivalent is. But for Gulen, that isn't in his theory of or theology of dialogue at all. It is empathetic acceptance of people, not trying to convert them. It is accepting them how they are. Gulen also says there should be a chair for everyone within your heart. And that's one of his kind of also famous phrases that most people from the movement themselves would recognize. Empathetic acceptance is very useful in getting to know the other. Engagement reaches a deeper level, though, on how can we reconcile our own convictions, support, learn, and borrow from others. So empathetic acceptance is all nice, but there is a reality that things on planet Earth may not all be nice, and there is a deeper level of connection, and on the connection level we're going to disagree on some fundamental things. And from here we see Gulen expanding on Said Nursi's argument, and Said Nursi is early 20th century scholar who's had a profound impact on Gulen's theology itself. However, Gulen takes Said Nursi's arguments and kind of, it doesn't necessarily adopt them word by word. There is some development in the theology there as well. Gulen suggests we should break things down to the basic components, and this is beautiful, such as actions and attributes, and respond to these components individually. This is something that Said Nursi also says, rather than judging the whole according to a particular part. So, for example, we must love and respect him or her for the sake of his or her humanness. If we dislike something about that person, we dislike an attribute of that person. For example, untruthfulness rather than the untruthful person. But again, I mean, this is where I kind of have a little or a very large question mark for the authors, who don't go into a lot of detail. The next point, not to disregard a culture or civilization due to certain qualities associated with it. We embrace the culture or civilization as a whole, but there are some qualities within it which we dislike, which is how the authors of this chapter have worded it, but they haven't gone on to describe, what possible element of a culture could there be that people of the Hizmet movement, or those who identify with Gulen himself, would dislike. That section of the chapter isn't open, and I don't think it is many, and I tried to kind of think, and I couldn't really think of any, but there may be, so I'll just say there wouldn't be many. But I think that's kind of a short, where the chapter itself falls short is, it makes this sweeping statement, which in itself is actually a very large statement, and doesn't go into detail anymore. But it's, the understanding is the same. When you're engaging in dialogue with someone, if there is something you don't like about them, you don't align that to their humanness. Through humanity, you have to and you must, through the divinely intended diversity, engage in dialogue and engage in sincere dialogue. And it's the attribute of that person, perhaps the untruthfulness that you dislike and you should dislike as an attribute, but you don't assign that to the person itself. It's a framework which may give dialogue participants confidence to engage wholeheartedly and borrow from one another without fear of having to compromise their own beliefs. And that was hoşgörü. Now we're on to the last section of how Gulen theologizes and says that, dialogue is in the fabric of Islam, is through positive action, the müsbet hareket that we mentioned before. For Gulen, this responsibility requires conscious effort and action. So this positive and proactive action is something that is necessary. Positive action for Gulen is proactive, not formulated in reaction to someone else's action or position, allowing them to determine your mode of action in an uninspiring approach and indicative of lack of belief in your own goals. So for Gulen, dialogue itself was extremely important. It was the fabric of Islam. You can't just wait for an event to happen. I gave 9/11 as an example before. You can't just wait for another 9/11 to happen to engage in dialogue. Dialogue is something that everybody should engage in and would within the theological framework in their everyday life. And it's important from that perspective. And it's not done because, an event happens and there's a strategy involved and the Muslim name, for example, is in a bad kind of, from a PR start, let's go and engage in dialogue isn't what Gulen means here. Although, he had mentioned there may be benefits to it as well from a more worldly view or understanding. Dialogue is necessary to maintain a positive mindset. It involves a level-headedness, calm, collective, and consistent approach. So there were the things that we mentioned, husnuzan in comparison to suizan, so seeing people in a positive light rather than a negative light, points out that when we see others in this light, assuming the worst of them, so if we see people in suizan in a negative light, assuming the worst of them, we nurture a suspicion of attitudes towards them and a sense of superiority in ourselves, and this sense of superiority in human in heart from an Islamic perspective is something that is very close to what you could define as shirk, or saying there is partners to Allah through saying that you have control of perhaps your actions and etc. So for this reason, in his other writings, Gulen has said that husn zan, or thinking positively about others and badly about yourself, is actually a form of worship itself. Suizan, so thinking in a negative light, destroys trust and goodwill and is incompatible with dialogue. So when you're going into dialogue, you have to go into dialogue wholeheartedly and thinking the positive or even the best for the people you're engaging with. Husnuzan, as a key concept of tasawwuf or within Sufi Islam and in Gulen's philosophy, has two interconnected meanings, both signifying thinking positively regarding God's design, so humanity, and thinking well of God's creatures, avoiding negative thoughts and feelings. These positive attitudes are at the core of dialogue and proper social conduct in Gulen's thinking. Gulen is decidedly against dialogue being used to convert people or use a melting pot in which people lose their identities. Gulen's against people feeling the need to compromise their faith as well to achieve dialogue. He often counsels people to be themselves in the process of dialogue. So there's kind of a lot of layers, thinking positively, being yourself, being open, being wholeheartedly, being a gönül insanı, being a person of the heart in this as well. And there's a lot of this structure, and there's a lot involved in actually the theology of dialogue itself. So that a good 40 minutes on the theology chapter, of theology section of this chapter. And now we're on to dialogue in practice, which is a much shorter, and I can see a lot has been written in the chat section, so perhaps we can come and describe the things later on. But dialogue in practice is how members of the Hizmet movement, or those who associate themselves with the values of Hizmet, go on and act upon these teachings. So through his teachings, Fethullah Gulen has inspired a transnational civil society, the Hizmet movement. The movement is faith-inspired yet faith-neutral, and this is kind of perhaps how we see it in the international schools, the dialogue facility. Faith may be a topic of conversation, but it doesn't mean that people from the movement are trying to convert anyone, or that at least is not in the theological understanding of dialogue for Gulen. Its activities and it is increasingly attracting support from people of diverse backgrounds and religions. So although many institutions associated with the movement may have a Turkish Muslim heritage, they are increasingly connecting with people from diverse backgrounds and religions. The movement is loosely connected through shared ideals and teachings. Gulen's general exposition of Islam has always been very inclusive, loving, and peacefully inherently dialogue. Gulen expressingly argues that dialogue is too important to be left to practitioners of dialogue or organizations alone. Dialogue is something that everyone needs to engage with. And there was a comment on me talking slow, so I just saw that I will try my hardest. These people and organizations may have a particular specialism. So you have some organizations who are leading dialogue, for example, and they may have expertise, but their efforts must be supported through collective and wider society and organization as a whole. And yes, it will be archived. We will download the video afterwards, hopefully. All people are dialogically predisposed, respectful of diversity. And in accordance with this view, those people and organizations inspired by Gulen, whether this is schools, whether this is universities, whether this is clinics, whether this is, homeless food shelters, whether this is relief charities, business associations, or any other form of kind of elements which people from the movement are inspired to start up, they share a commitment to dialogue approaches to bring more of a humane, loving, care and peaceful society. So it's involved in that sense. Schools guided by the principles of Gulen's vision have been founded in around 150 countries, And these are some regions which have ongoing conflict. We had mentioned Afghanistan before, we had mentioned Southeast Turkey before, you have Bosnia Herzegovina as well, you have Pakistan, you have northern Iraq, you have these people from a variety of these countries, from a variety of intergroup conflicts or sectarian conflicts, and the school plays a very important role in this, because the schools also embody dialogue, because dialogue is as Gulen says, a theological principle. And this is noted, the authors of this chapter have kind of given an example by Father Thomas Michael with reference to the Philippine Turkish school specifically. He visited the school in 1995, so Father Thomas, at the time where the area was in a lot of inter-community violence between Muslims and Christians. Around half of the school students, so the Philippine Turkish school, half of them were Muslim and the other half Christian. Father Michael states that the school offered them an excellent education and a more positive way of living and relating to one another. So this is just one of the multiple examples of how the understanding of dialogue has contributed to the betterment of society as a whole. Then it later goes on to say, because the movement is not centrally organised, it is not possible to determine the number of Gulen-inspired dialogue organisations, but it is safe to assume that there are Gulen-inspired dialogue organisations in approximately 150 countries. This is where I kind of disagree to an extent with the authors here. It may be hard to kind of say a concrete number, but these dialogue institutions also feed off of best practice sharing from regional understandings of one another as well. So they may not be centrally organized, they may have their own agendas and discuss within their own teams as well, but it's not as simple as that, perhaps, which I think is important to kind of reference as well. Gulen is not officially linked to any of them, so not officially or directly linked to any of them, except a handful which he is the honorary chairman. And you have a couple of examples here: the Journalist and Writers Foundation, which was in Istanbul and closed now, the Rumi Forum in Washington, DC, and the Intercultural Dialogue Platform in Brussels. From this section, it kind of swiftly goes into a 12-point kind of summary, or the guiding principles, of dialogue, which the Dialogue Society, a London-based organisation, has come up with. And I've just highlighted a few from here. While founded and led by Muslims, to be an organisation serving mainstream society, which is something that we touched upon. It's dynamic, so dialogue has to be dynamic. Dialogue is to come together around humanness. We are human first, then Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Jew, or other. Those engaging in dialogue embrace everyone with love, compassion, and empathetic acceptance. There must be a place in your heart for everyone. This is kind of, the Gönül İnsanı concept that we discussed. To insist on peace as the default position, however difficult, peace must be sought, which I think is a beautiful point to make. To recognise that dialogue is inherently as well as instrumentally valuable. So dialogue has an Islamic theological basis, as well as being instrumentally valuable, and the instrument valuability comes from the practice of dialogue itself. To be mindful that dialogue is a natural human expression and that diversity is an intended phenomenon, and we've read that in the Quranic verses. That dialogue is positive and proactive. Based on such guiding principles, Gulen-inspired dialogue charities worldwide undertake tens of thousands of dialogue initiatives and projects each year, trying to reach out to the disengaged. Grassroots of society, as well as academics, as well as journalists, as well as policymakers and community leaders, and those all around, and kind of bringing this together. And then it gives an example of the UK dialogue organisation, inspired by the values of Hizmet, and some of the work they do. had a master's degree in dialogue studies. They launched the Journal of Dialogue Studies, a dialogue school, and this very book from which, this is a chapter from which the book was published by the Dialogue Society, and there are very many other points of reflection. Saying the word reflection, the end of the book comes towards some questions of which people may like to reflect on, and then it goes on to the texts used, the bibliography, and then some recommended reading, which I think is a beautiful kind of start as well. There are some examples of Gulen's work that could be read. There are some books on Gulen's movement and some books on the practical application of dialogue, which is very valuable. The Muslim World in Transition conference proceedings, for example, gives numerous world examples of the dialogue movement in action. Muslim Citizens of the Globalized World is another book. Gulen Movement, Civic Service Without Borders, for example. These are good books on how Hizmet values are kind of putting around a sense of organisation and how they're enacted throughout the globe. But yeah, that is in 50 minutes a review of the booklet that the Centre for Hizmet Studies has published. You can access it free of charge. It is on the website. It is in the biography section of this Instagram page for the time being, before we choose our new reading for next month. But I seen that a lot of people have commented throughout the discussion. If there's anyone who kind of has anything that they'd like to add, perhaps question about the kind of reading that we've had, more than open to that. I mean, if to start a further discussion, I could ask them of the questions that we have here. But I'll just give it a couple of seconds to see if anyone would like to type some questions that they have, perhaps. And we are 55 people, so one person could perhaps join. Nope, we have some writings in languages which I unfortunately do not. I briefly explained myself. Ismail Sizgin has commented. We both are co-chairs of the Centre for Hizmet Studies, and yeah, I'm London based at least. Who are you? I am Aisha. I am finalising my master's thesis now at SOAS University of London. I work as co-chair for the Centre for Hizmet Studies, and also as a research fellow with the Dialogue Society. So that is me in a nutshell. Yeah, okay. I mean, just to kind of end the discussion, I'll pick one of the questions for reflection, and we can have perhaps some commentary on it. Some of them seem longer. Okay, perhaps the first question. Gulen's teachings have an immense impact, not only in Turkey, but also internationally. What makes him so influential? Yes, so Sadaka has a question coming through, which is very actually specifically linked to the question that I've just read. So while volunteers of the Hizmet movement seek to promote an inclusive dialogue between diverse groups, the majority of them are still Muslim, and the majority of them are from a Turkish heritage. How can this happen, and what should we be doing to overcome this? Is this because the dialogue would take generations to give fruit? Yeah, if anyone has any comments on this, perhaps, this the question that I asked is I thought similar, but perhaps the exact opposite. Gulen's teachings have had an immense impact, not also only in Turkey but also internationally. But this impact has been led by Muslims and has been led by Muslims of Turkish heritage. What makes Gulen so influential? And if we have another question as well, there are other Muslim scholars in the West engaging actively in dialogue. How is Gulen different from those scholars, perhaps? Perhaps, these are questions that we can take and start our next session on with after we've discussed our and decided on our next reading. So I will end it now, I assume. And please do feel free to just direct message this account, Hizmet Studies account, and if you have any suggestions on what our next reading should be, feel free to directly message this account as well. I assume we'll have decided with the kind of more regular members of the book club as well, and update you through this channel within a week, I assume. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening. We're at 57 people now, which is a number I was not expecting at all. But thank you for being with us, for those who were here from the start, for those who were looking forward to it. Hopefully, this publication was a publication of the Center for Hizmet Studies. It was from a pro-Hizmet stance. Perhaps next time we could do something a bit more critical and engage in those arguments and those dynamics as well. So thank you, and see you next month.